Hello and welcome to the Flourishing Introvert Talks with me, Jo Rawbone. This is the podcast that celebrates the natural gifts of introverts so that we can flourish in all situations.
Episode 251, Being Our Own Ally. For the regular listeners, you'll remember an episode a few weeks ago about being an introvert advocate, including how we can advocate for ourselves. So I can understand if you're a bit perplexed and wondering if and how this is different. So in this episode, I'll be clarifying the distinction between allies and advocates, reinforcing why we need to do both for ourselves, and importantly, sharing some very practical hows. The pragmatist in me always wants you to leave with some actionable steps to get you started. So the place to begin is clearly with the key differences. Advocates tend to publicly support, defend or promote a cause, in my case, the rights of introverts to have a level playing field. So when I said in my 2019 TEDx that I am the voice of the unheard introvert, that was me advocating. What's really interesting is that I'd not planned to say that line, and the idea had never occurred to me until that moment on stage. It caught me out somewhat. Allies, on the other hand, provide active support and encouragement to those who face challenges, again, in my case, introverts who are subjected to the bias towards the extrovert ideal in business, education and society. While advocates focus on interventions that bring about structural or systemic change, allies focus on providing personal support with empathy within a specific relationship. Unlike advocates, this can be quite subtle, done in private or at least behind the scenes. Now here's where we get to the really important stuff. It's such a gift if you have others who are your allies and even advocates. But the most important thing to do is not wait expectantly. You see, the reality is, if we sit back and wait for others to stand at our shoulder or to raise our voices, we could be waiting for a long time. There's only one answer: to do those things for ourselves. And I can tell you from experience that people are much more likely to help those who are already helping themselves. And just to be clear, when I say people, I mean me. I am much more likely to be an ally for someone who demonstrates that they are intentionally being an ally for themselves. Why, you might ask? Aren't those with no support more worthy of your help? Well, yes and no is my answer. It's complicated, so let me try to explain. My more than 30 years as a leadership, management and professional skills trainer and coach has taught me many things. One of the most important is that you can't coach someone who doesn't want to be coached. In the same vein, if my clients are not prepared to meet me halfway, and by that I mean show real intent to learn and grow, no amount of coaxing will entice them into the learning space. Learning is tough for most of us, especially when it comes to changing our behaviour and habits. And I'll not soften the reality. All learning and growth is about change. But here's the lesson I found the most difficult to learn in my earlier years. Just because people complain doesn't mean they are ready or willing to change. In fact, sometimes it's quite the opposite. I've met many clients and even more potential clients who are serial and loud complainers, but who are unprepared to take any responsibility or action for themselves, which is a big red flag for me. And it's not just me being mean or unnecessarily tough. It is a form of tough love though, and that's what you get from quietly gutsy me. I'm not that tolerant of excuses, especially when I've heard them more than once. And yes, I know we face particular challenges in business and education, with practices, processes and culture skewed in favour of the extroverts, which is why I advocate for myself and for my fellow introverts. My intention when I rattle cages noisily is to get those biased practices changed. And I need to start by being my own ally and looking at how I may be colluding with the bias. You see, it's all too easy to point fingers and blame others, when in reality I could be doing more for myself. But of course that's so much harder than blaming. So how do I start being an ally to myself? Step 1 for me is self-acceptance, closely followed by a commitment to my own development. And before you panic, that doesn't mean becoming more extroverted. It does mean developing the necessary skills and embedding behaviours so that you can be the best version of yourself. So self-acceptance is about knowing and understanding yourself better, including your own type of introversion, because we are all so different. Just last episode I explored how we introverts need to understand our strengths and talents by regularly conducting an audit, and I'd recommend that you do that in the service of becoming your own ally. Oh, and stop the comparing yourself with others, will you? True allies don't do that. Of course you'll notice big differences if you compare yourself to many of the extroverts out there. They're wired differently to us, and difference is not bad, it's just different. Remember what Caroline McHugh says about the importance of finding our interiority, because that's incomparable. This involves a mindset shift for some of us, as we may have started to believe the narrative that introverts are somehow less than. Can you see how, if you hold that belief that somehow you're less than and hard done by, supporting yourself empathically may just descend into victimhood? I certainly caved into the pressure to fit in if I wanted to get on, and it felt unfair. That should have been the time that I noticed that frustration and used it as fuel or a bridge to my own growth. So self-allyship is not about letting yourself off the hook and saying, never mind, they're there, it's too tough, so look, just slink back into your corner and let's hope no one notices you. No, self-allyship is giving yourself time to, number 2, feel your emotions. They are yours and they are real after all. Then with that commitment to development, it's time to look for what you can do to turn things around. This might be reframing any negative self-talk, flipping any limiting beliefs, and upholding your boundaries assertively. Mastering all of those, and more to boot, are essential skills and abilities needed by introverts who are serious about being their own allies and reaching their potential, which is why we address them during your frustrated to flourishing journey. So another thing that's important and a kind thing to do for yourself is number 3, to stick to your schedule for pre- and recharging. The temptation is to let everything go out of the window when we're feeling sorry for ourselves, but I can share from bitter experience that this is when we need to pay more attention, not less. Pause, take time out, switch off for a while. There's very little that won't wait 20 minutes or so, even though our panicked and overthinking mind will try to have us believe otherwise. I also suggest that you, number 4, check the role your inner critic may be playing. My inner critic, Gladys, likes to keep me on my toes and will occasionally throw in a grenade to knock me off my feet. She's a cunning one, but over time I've been able to discern when she is raising something that I need to pay attention to and when she's having a moment of panic. I talked about something related to this on the latest Dropping Pebbles in the Pond episode with my guest Sophie Bryan. We played with the idea of taking fear out on a date, and I know that my inner critic was slightly panicked that I might face my fears more playfully in the future. I'll include how you can watch the show in the episode notes. I think you'll want to check it out. It's also fantastically helpful to, number 5, up your gratitude practice when you need to support yourself more. Capture each and every one of the tiny things that you are proud of yourself for or did well, even if it's that I kept my mouth shut when being provoked. There are times when asserting yourself is what's needed, and other times where we need to learn to pick our battles in order to preserve our energy for the big one. I almost can't say enough about the importance of gratitude when it comes to self-allyship. When we set out to intentionally notice, recognise and celebrate even our smallest wins, we're building and strengthening our confidence. Every accomplishment, every milestone, every piece of motivational feedback we acknowledge is like placing another brick in the foundation of our confidence. Maybe the biggest shift for us is to get really good at number 6, self-compassion and empathy. We often talk about empathy as being like walking in another's shoes. But how about we really feel what it's like to walk in our own shoes? Back to the allowing ourselves to feel and not wallow in our emotions. Think and speak kindly of and to yourself. There's a really lovely idea that you speak to yourself as you would to a friend you love. And of course that means that you really need to love yourself first. Not in an egotistical, arrogant way, but in a kind, unconditional, gentle way. For instance, if you make a mistake, you're not stupid, you made a mistake. If you receive developmental feedback, you're not useless, you're learning. If you need help, it's not a sign of weakness, you have enough humility to ask for help. This is still a tricky one for me sometimes. Finally, for this initial list that you can action, I'm adding number 7, be mindful who you mix with. I've spoken before about how behaviour breeds behaviour, the Batari's box model, and I love the Jim Rohn quote, "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." Think about that for a moment. If you're not particular, you might be spending more time with pessimists or cruel people with narcissistic tendencies who take great joy in gaslighting you. Think I'm kidding? This describes many of the people with whom I've intentionally distanced myself over the past 10 years. It took me a while to learn my lessons and let go of the guilt because in some cases they're blood relatives. And surely I should tolerate their behaviour. Nuh-uh. The last birthday card my dear departed friend Kim sent me said, "Friends are the family we choose." If your family or friends are not upping your average on any positive aspect, it's time to distance yourself. It's also a good idea to check on your closest network and upgrade that where necessary too. If you're surrounded by energy vampires, dementors and the like, it's time for a change. It's not unkind, not cruel, not even cold. It's self-preservation and the basis of your flourishing. So in this episode, I've explored how being your own ally is essential to self-advocacy. I've given you 7 steps that you can take, and it really doesn't matter where you start. Given that we're going to be thrust into the company of others over the next few weeks, maybe it's a good thing to be really observant and decide if they are who you want to be supporting your flourishing.
If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, then please subscribe, rate us and leave a comment, because we know that that helps other people find the podcast. And if other people find us, other introverts can flourish.
You are listening to an Intentional Media Production podcast.